This episode is brought to you by Christendom, a big tent platform for Catholic content creators. Say goodbye to endlessly browsing for Catholic content. At Christendom, we make it simple to follow, share, and save your favorite creators' content. Join our community at christendom.app. It's free.
Hi, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we look back over the past 7 days on the Vatican and global Catholic Church beat, try to pick out those few points that are of particular interest. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with dueling deficits. Pope Francis last week wrote to the cardinals of the world to say that there is a looming debt crisis with regard to the Vatican's pension fund, but in order to deal with that, the Pope may first have to face a trust deficit with his own workforce. We'll explain what's going on there. Secondly, Rupnik Round 2. You may remember that as the scandal surrounding Father Mario Rupnik, the former Jesuit, who has been accused of the sexual abuse of some 30 or 40 adult women over the course of 20 or 30 years, as those scandals were unfolding, there was a particular moment at which Pope Francis held a meeting with one of Rupnik's greatest defenders and allies without having met any of Rupnik's victims, thus exacerbating the situation and causing enormous scandal. This past weekend, in fact, Pope Francis once again held a meeting with people perceived as having ties to and being allies of an organization in Peru that has been accused of abuse and misconduct without having met any of the alleged victims or survivors. We'll unpack what happened and how those victims and survivors are reacting. Third up this week, we've got Padre Pio Pray for Us. The hospital in southern Italy, the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the House of Relief of Suffering, that was founded by Padre Pio in 1956, is facing crippling debts and labor difficulties. We'll explain what's going on and what a survival strategy might look like. Finally, this week, we've got leaning on Lucifer, how at a critical moment in history, the Vatican actually got a solid in terms of preserving its vision of church-state relations from none other than Lucifer himself. We'll explain that too. All that and more is waiting for you on this week's episode of Last Week in the Church. So please don't go anywhere because I will be right back. Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, November 26th. This, of course, if you're an American, is Thanksgiving week. And even if you're not, it sort of is Thanksgiving week because everybody knows that the American holiday of Thanksgiving takes place this week. And if you are in the United States, I want you to make full use of the family, food, and football that is awaiting you this week, because those are, of course, the perennially 3 pillars of a successful Thanksgiving experience. All right, so we begin this week with dueling deficits. So for the third time this fall, on November 19th, Pope Francis put pen to paper. That's, of course, a metaphor. Nobody actually uses pen and paper anymore, but in any event, Pope Francis dispatched a letter to the cardinals of the world about the Vatican's financial woes. In this case, it had to do with the worst-kept secret in the Vatican, which is that its pension system is in deep, deep trouble. 10 years ago, when the Pope named the late Cardinal George Pell as the first head of the new Secretariat for the Economy, one of the first warnings Cardinal Pell delivered was that the pension system was in real trouble. The Vatican did not have the resources to meet its future obligations. In a later interview, he once said that in large part because of the pension crisis, the Vatican, quote, is slowly going broke. Okay? So, no real surprise that this week the Pope wrote to the cardinals to alert them to a major deficit in the pension system and what he called a serious imbalance between resources and obligations, which means that in the medium term, without intervention, the Vatican will not have the resources to meet its obligations. And he said fixing this is going to require, serious measures, including a willingness to sacrifice by all. Okay? Now, that invitation to sacrifice in order to fix what everyone recognizes is a serious problem with the Vatican pension fund was greeted with a bit of, how would one put it, skepticism, diffidence, ambiguity, and ambivalence, whatever, by Vatican workers in the form of the Association of Lay Vatican Employees, or ADLV in the Italian acronym, which is the closest thing the Vatican has to a labor union. The Pope's letter was November 19th. On November 21st, the association put out its own statement, and basically it boiled down to, hey, wait a minute. And they made several points, okay? Point number one, they said, okay, we all know there's a problem. This has been said for years. However, let's point out that we don't know what the problem is because you have never, ever published the account sheets. That is the balance, the actual numbers of the pension fund. You say there's a deficit. We're sure there is, but we don't know exactly what it is. Let me point out that that deficit has been estimated at around $660 million for the Roman Curia. If you add in the Vatican City-State and the Vicariate of Rome, it comes to a little over $1 billion. But as I say, those are estimates. The workers are making the point that no actual financial statement for the pensions fund has ever been issued. And as they point out, we're the ones paying for it. Okay? It's the contributions that come out of our salaries that go into this pension fund. We have a right to know exactly how much money it has and how that money is being invested, how it's being spent. So that's number one. You can't ask us to sacrifice if you won't tell us exactly what we're being asked to sacrifice for. The second point they made was that workers in the Holy See have already sacrificed a great deal. They made the point that from 2021 to 2023, for instance, amid shortfalls caused by the COVID pandemic, the Vatican actually suspended a customary every 2-year pay raise related to seniority. The association pointed out that if you project the loss of that biennial increase over the course of a career, the average Vatican employee could lose something like $20,000, which is, not nothing. They also pointed out that their salaries have not been adjusted for inflation, but the rents they pay in Vatican-owned apartments have been adjusted for inflation. So their salaries don't cover as much ground. They've lost money because of cost-cutting measures. They're saying, hey, we've done what we can. Third, they point out that despite the alleged financial difficulties of the Vatican, that doesn't seem to have stopped the system either A, from hiring expensive external consultants who swoop in, deploy a team of eggheads and experts, and then leave, informing the Vatican it's got a problem, a point which everyone knew before they got here. So that's number one. Number two, they point out that these alleged financial shortfalls also have not prevented the occasional hiring of new lay managers in various departments as exceptions to a general hiring freeze with salaries that are well beyond the norm. paid for Vatican employees. And their point basically is the workers, if you're looking for places to cut, maybe you could try those things. But most basically, they say, look, we'd be willing to try to help if you would talk to us. But they say repeated requests they have made for dialogue with superiors in the system have been shut down. And they say, before we are going to help out in any campaign to fix this problem, we first want to have a seat at the table and a voice in the conversation about the best way forward. Bottom line, if Pope Francis is serious about wanting to fix the pension deficit, he may first need to remedy the trust deficit he faces with his own workforce. And notice I managed to say all of that without even pointing out the obvious, towering irony that the Pope just wrapped up a 3-year synodal process predicated on inclusion, participation, and dialogue without really exactly practicing it in his own backyard. We'll see how things unfold. All right, second up this week, Rupnik Round 2. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, one of the real flashpoints of controversy in the saga involving Marco Rupnik came in September 2023 when Pope Francis granted an audience to Maria Campitelli, who is the director of the Centro Aletti founded by Rupnik here in Rome, a great ally and a great supporter. She has been the leading voice denying and dismissing all of the abuse charges against Rupnik. Pope Francis had this very friendly conversation with her. Photos were released afterwards of the two of them smiling and so on. And this happened well before, without the Pope ever having met any of Rupnik's victims or accusers. And, it just sort of set off a firestorm of controversy. In tandem with some other things, it led to Pope Francis reversing an earlier decision that prosecuting Rupnik was prevented by a canonical statute of limitations. The Pope waived that and allowed a prosecution to proceed that, so far as we know anyway, is still underway. Well, you might have thought that out of all of that, Pope Francis would have learned his lesson. And yet, at least in the eyes of critics, he basically repeated the same pattern this weekend. The Pope received a pair of Peruvian lay people named Cacha e Blanco, who had originally come to notoriety because they asked to be heard during a Vatican investigation of the Sodality of Christian Life, or SCV, a Peruvian lay movement that has been at the center of a storm of allegation of various forms of abuse for some time now. Cacho y Blanca showed up to give testimony during this Vatican investigation, during which, reportedly, they basically extolled the spirituality of the SCV and accused 2 former SCV members of harassing them. Basically, they would be seen as sort of allies of the SCV. At the bare minimum, you can say they certainly have links, because Blanco's brother was the longtime personal secretary of Luis Fernando Figari, who was the founder of the SCV and recently has been kicked out by Vatican edict. And Cacha is actually married to that brother. So, clearly there are kind of family ties. And once again, and let me add that these two, Cacha y Blanco, had actually filed a criminal charge in Peru against one of the Vatican investigators, Spanish Monsignor Jordi Bertomeu, on the grounds that they charged Bertomeu had divulged confidential information about their testimony. Now, it turned out upon examination that there were plenty of ways that information could have come to public light. But in any event, in September, Cacha y Blanco were threatened with a papal decree of excommunication if they didn't withdraw this criminal charge. Everyone thought that this was part of a kind of inexorable process of holding the SCV accountable, which many people thought would eventually lead to the group's dissolution. This weekend, however, Pope Francis actually gave an audience to Cacio Blanco. And although the Vatican didn't say anything about it, Cacio Blanco made a video immediately, which they posted on social media, saying, great conversation with the Pope. He, in his own hand, canceled or annulled that decree of excommunication, and he told us to keep going. Now, you can imagine how that made, people who believe themselves to be victims and survivors of abuse by the SCV and its related organizations, how it made them feel. Many have taken to social media to talk about how betrayed they feel about all this, particularly in light of the fact that many of them have been requesting FaceTime with the Pope quite literally for years and have never been able to get it. And yet, in the relative blink of an eye, these two people who were perceived to be tied to their abusers, these two people are able to get in and see the Pope. Now, whether this plays out the same way as the Rupnik meeting did, whether it generates the same kind of momentum for the Pope to reverse course and become more stern with the alleged abusers in this case, remains to be seen. But at a bare minimum, one could say that the same kind of shock and disappointment and pain that the victims and survivors experienced over that first Rupnik meeting is once again being voiced by a different group of survivors and victims over this meeting, some of whom are saying, for the first time, because of this Vatican investigation, we had begun to recover a bit of hope, a bit of faith in the process, and now, once again, that has been dashed. We'll see how all of this plays out. But at a bare minimum, I think it's fair to say this probably is not a good optic for the Pope, at least seen through the lens of the victim and survivors community. All right, start up this week, we have Padre Pio pray for us. So the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the House of Relief of Suffering, is the largest and most sophisticated hospital in all of southern Italy, traditionally the most impoverished and disadvantaged part of the Italian peninsula. It's located in the province of Puglia in southern Italy on what is known as the spur of the heel of the peninsula, in a community called San Giovanni Rotondo, which is also where the Capuchin Friary, where Padre Pio lived most of his life, is located. Now, the hospital has been dealing with debts for quite some time. That's well known. A couple of years ago, the Vatican's top economic official, the guy who heads the Secretariat for the Economy, said that it had to take urgent measures or, it was unclear what the future might be. Recently, there have been rumors that the hospital was actually in negotiations to be bought out by various private concerns. These are basically sort of big-time private healthcare chains, holding companies that own a number of hospitals and clinics, so on, around Italy and around the world. Now, over the weekend, the hospital issued a sharp denial that that was the case, saying there is no foundation whatsoever for reports that it's considering selling, and that in fact, no negotiations with anyone to that effect are underway. It should be pointed out, by the way, that the hospital couldn't sell itself anyway because it actually is Vatican property. Okay, it's owned by the Vatican. It's one of only 2 hospitals in the world that are directly owned by the Vatican, the other being the Rome-based pediatric hospital Bambino Gesù. So they're saying selling out is off the table, but that doesn't really resolve the question of how they're going to stop the financial bleeding. The mayor of San Giovanni Rotondo this week, who was also, by the way, a physician of nuclear medicine at the hospital, confirmed that the debt currently facing the hospital is somewhere in the neighborhood of $260 million and getting worse all the time. There is currently a 3-year recovery plan in place that is premised on improving efficiency, reducing the number of bed spaces in the hospital, and also only selectively replacing roughly 350 employees who are projected to retire between now and 2026. Should be said, however, that a number of independent financial experts who have looked at all this have cast doubt on the idea that that's actually going to be enough to right the ship. In the meantime, the hospital is also dealing with some fairly serious labor difficulties. This week, there were meetings with unions representing the various sectors of employees of the hospital. So the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the janitorial and sanitation staff, and so forth and so on. Those meetings were held on Tuesday and Thursday. They were not, to put it euphemistically, they were not tremendously successful. In fact, at various points, the unions walked out of these negotiations in protest. New meetings are now scheduled for December 5th, but if they don't succeed in brokering some kind of agreement, there is talk of strikes, brownouts, work stoppages, various forms of expressing discontent on the part of the workforce. Among other things, they're complaining that contracts have not been renewed. Also, people lower down the food chain are complaining of disproportionate treatment versus, say, the medical personnel. Like the paramedics are pointing out, the hospital theoretically pays bonuses for efficiency in performance. However, if you look at those monthly payouts, a doctor can make more than $500 a month. A paramedic can only make about $65. They're saying, given that our salaries are smaller already, that doesn't really seem fair. So you've got huge financial problems, you've got deep labor problems. And so the question is, how is this hospital, which is the signature Catholic hospital in, as I said, the most impoverished and disadvantaged region of the country, and under direct Vatican ownership and management, how is this hospital to be saved, particularly at a moment when the Vatican itself is not really rolling in dough? Well, asked that question, the mayor of San Giovanni Rotondo said, probably it'll take a miracle, but fortunately, this is the hospital of Padre Pio. So, the hope is that Padre Pio will work some magic on the behalf of his hospital. We will see. Finally, this week, we got Leaning on Lucifer. This comes from the Only in Italy files, folks. Okay. So, one of the critical moments in church-state relations in Italy was 1947. After World War II, Italians were asked in a referendum in 1946 to choose between remaining a monarchy, or rather going back to being a monarchy, which is what it was before the fascist regime, or becoming a democratic republic. They voted for the republic, and so a special constituent assembly was elected to draft a new constitution. Now, one of the hot button issues in that drafting process was the issue of relations between church and state in the new Italian Republic. The Vatican's position was that that question had been settled for all time by the 1929 Lateran Pax. Now, that was negotiated with the Mussolini government, but the Vatican's position was it was an international treaty and that neither state, which were signatories to this treaty, can unilaterally change it without the consent of the other. On the other hand, the communists and socialists, by the way, I should say, that position was supported by the Christian Democrats in that constituent assembly, who were a slight majority along with their allies. But the communists and socialists and their allies were opposed on the grounds that if they could somehow toss out the Lateran Pacts, maybe they could get a better deal. The Lateran Pacts not only involved mutual recognition and an Italian payout to the Vatican for loss of the Papal States, but it also governed things like the teaching of Catholicism in Italian schools, teaching of religion in Italian schools, things like the civil recognition of ecclesiastical decrees, especially regarding marriage and so on. I mean, all that kind of stuff. And so basically, the communists and the socialists were saying, we don't want to be stuck with this forever. We want to get a better deal, okay? Now, just when it seemed like this impasse was too great to overcome, a legislator emerged without ties to either major party who proposed a solution. He said, look, why don't we say that church-state relations will be governed by the Lateran Pacts, but that future changes to those pacts, which both parties agree upon, won't require an amendment to the Constitution. Now, that allowed the Vatican to get what it wanted, which was recognition of the Lateran Pacts, but it also allowed the opposition to get what it wanted, which was leaving the door open to future changes. And so, Article 7 of the Constitution was adopted, church-state relations were saved, everybody's happy. Who, ladies and gentlemen, was this legislator who saved the day? His name was Roberto Lucifer. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. If we translate that into English, Bob Lucifer saved the day, saved the Vatican's bacon in terms of church-state relations in the new Italian Republic. No, folks, Mr. Lucifer was not a goth, head-banging, anarchist Satan worshiper. The Lucifers were actually a distinguished Italian noble family. Their roots go back to antiquity. Of course, in ancient Rome, Lucifero, Lucifer, meant literally in Latin, it means bearer of light. It was a reference to the planet Venus as the morning star, the first light you see in the morning. In other words, it was a positive thing, okay? And so it became, in Italy, a common last name. There have been Lucifers who have been bishops and archbishops. In Cagliari in Sardinia, there is even a Saint Lucifer. You can venerate him if you like by going to the Church of Saint Lucifer on Lucifer Drive in Cagliari. And so, that does not carry any necessarily negative connotations, but my point, folks, is that only in Italy could it turn out to be the case that the interests of the Catholic Church at a critical moment in national history were preserved and saved for what has turned out to be, the entire period since the creation of the Republic, that the Church was done this solid by a guy named Lucifer. So, when the Rolling Stones talked about sympathy for the devil, they might have looked at the Catholic Church in Italy and the Holy See as a place that, might, at least in this one limited sense, be a bit open to that idea. All right, that is our show for this week. You'll find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Again, those of you who are in the States, and even those of you who aren't, I hope you have a happy and fantastic Thanksgiving. Beyond that, please have a joyful and blessed next 7 days. We will be back here next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel, with the latest and greatest from the Vatican beat. Stay well, stay healthy. I will talk to you again very, very soon.